get ready for a deep and inspiring journey. In today's video, you'll follow the story of John, a war veteran who, despite bearing invisible scars, found a new purpose by helping others face their own battles. This is a story about overcoming hope and the strength of a united community. So, if you're ready to feel the transformative power that only solidarity and courage can bring, join us. Watch now and discover the power of a renewed life. The house of John Miller was quiet, but its interior was filled with shadows. The walls, once alive with family photos, now seemed suffocating, shrouded in a dimness that mirrored his inner state. John, a war veteran who had served in intense and dangerous missions, barely recognized the man who now inhabited that space. Once known for his strong spirit and unshakable confidence, the war had transformed him. The battlefield, with its explosions and screams, was left behind physically, but within John, the echoes of war remained, like an unrelenting ghost refusing to leave. Sitting on the edge of the bed in a silent dawn, John stared into the darkness. Sleep was a luxury he rarely reached. Instead of rest, sleep was often interrupted by nightmares. In his dreams, he was still there, the sound of gunfire, the smell of gunpowder, and the faces of familiar and unknown people he would never see again. Every time he closed his eyes, he was transported back to the battlefield, reliving scenes he'd rather forget. These restless, sleepless nights left marks on his face, sunken eyes, pale skin, an invisible weight that aged him beyond his years. The post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, he carried was not just a series of painful memories. It was a constant presence, infiltrating his daily life, turning simple moments into challenges. When he tried to walk around town, the sound of a loud horn could make him jump in fear, as if he were under attack again. In a cafe, the innocent murmur of conversations around him quickly turned into an unbearable cacophony, a feeling that suffocated him and forced him to leave in a hurry. The war not only took away his peace but also his ability to connect with the people around him. Visits from friends and family became rare, and he preferred it that way. Over time, they stopped insisting, leaving him in his isolation. He knew it was difficult for them to understand what he was going through. Attempts at normal conversations felt empty and meaningless, as if they belonged to another life. Sarah, his younger sister, had been one of the few to persist. She called frequently, leaving voice messages he rarely replied to. In one of the latest messages, she said in a sad voice, "John, I'm here, I always will be. I just need you to let me in." But he never returned the call. It was too painful to let someone see his wounds. The shame of his vulnerability kept him from opening any doors, as if admitting his weaknesses would invalidate all the years he'd spent in the army. In John's mind, showing his scars was like betraying the comrades who didn't return. He held on to the belief that he had to be strong, even if it meant facing the pain alone. He thought that, somehow, the suffering was his burden, a penance for survival. However, the walls he had built around himself were beginning to show cracks. Last night, during a panic attack, he found himself begging for the pain to stop. He didn't know exactly what he meant by it. Perhaps he was finally admitting to himself that he couldn't go on like that. But right after the moment of vulnerability, he rose again, renewing his commitment to isolation. Accepting help seemed impossible. He felt no one would understand what he had been through. No one could reach the depth of his pain. As the sun began to rise the next morning, a faint light filtered through his bedroom window. He watched the bedroom walls light up, and for a moment he felt a flicker of hope. Something in that light reminded him of what an old friend from the army, Tommy, had once said, "Sometimes, we need something bigger than ourselves to lift us up." It was a phrase he hadn't thought much of at the time, but now it resonated differently. What if, somehow, there was a way to overcome that pain? With a heavy sigh, John got up, looking at the soft light that illuminated the room. He knew that thought was still very new, a vague idea that had not yet gained strength. But for the first time in a long time, something inside him began to hesitate. Perhaps he didn't need to keep facing the darkness alone. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to find peace, even if he didn't know how yet. The hesitant thought that had arisen that morning did not disappear. For days, John continued his routine of isolation, But Tommy's words lingered in his mind, like a small flame refusing to go out. Finally, on a cold Sunday afternoon, while watching a news report on veterans, he felt an unexpected urge. The reporter's words spoke of a volunteer program to help veterans reintegrate into society. Without thinking much, John wrote down the contact number displayed on the screen. 2 weeks passed before he actually picked up the phone to call. The warm voice on the other end was Martha, the program coordinator, who seemed genuinely enthusiastic to hear he was interested. She invited him to a welcome event for veterans the following Saturday. John hesitated but accepted the invitation. He knew that, for someone in his condition, taking that step was like crossing an emotional minefield, but there was something within him that wanted to try. That Saturday morning, John put on an old coat and headed to the provided address. The event was held at a simple but welcoming community center. Upon entering, he was greeted by Martha, a woman with an open smile and firm hands, who welcomed him with a warm handshake. She introduced him to the group, composed of men and women of different ages, all with battle stories similar to his own. At first, John kept to the sidelines, observing from afar. He felt out of place, as if he were somewhere he didn't belong. But as the minutes passed, something curious happened. He began to recognize some of the signs in the people around him: the restlessness of a man who avoided eye contact, the distant expression of a woman who anxiously fidgeted with her hands. Each of them bore their own weight, traces of an invisible struggle he knew all too well. During a break, John was approached by Peter, a younger veteran who had served in Afghanistan. Peter had a nervous energy and gestured as he spoke, clearly eager to share his story. He described how hard it had been to return home and adjust to civilian life, a narrative that mirrored John's own journey. Listening to Peter, John felt a genuine connection, as if, for the first time in a long while, he had found someone who truly understood the depth of his scars. The hours passed quickly, and at the end of the event, Martha suggested that John attend the meetings regularly. Hesitantly, he nodded in agreement. There was a familiarity in those stories and faces that comforted him in an unexpected way. He wasn't ready to share his own story aloud, but somehow, simply being there brought him relief. Watching other veterans seek support, he felt that perhaps there was a possible road to healing. As he said goodbye to Martha and the others, John noticed that his heart felt a little lighter. Walking back home, he found himself reflecting on the stories he'd heard. Perhaps, he thought, the road to recovery wasn't a solitary journey. Maybe the first step to healing was actually accepting that he didn't have to face the battle alone. When he arrived home, he took off his coat and, without exactly knowing why, picked up the phone to call Sarah. His sister answered almost immediately, her voice carrying a tone of surprise and concern. John hesitated, but with a sigh, he simply said, "Hi, Sarah. I think I need help." He didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to find out. From that moment on, John's life began to change. He continued attending the veterans group, each meeting bringing a new perspective and a sense of belonging he no longer believed possible. The meetings became a weekly ritual. Gradually, John started to relax, allowing himself to listen and, eventually, to share. At first, he limited himself to simple comments, but over time, he found the courage to reveal parts of his story, small pieces of a pain that had once seemed impossible to verbalize. One of the biggest surprises was the friendship he developed with Peter, the young veteran who had approached him at the first event. Peter was a constant presence in the group, and his chaotic energy and nervous laughter brought a lightness that contrasted with the weight of the stories shared there. Beside him, John found a sort of anchor, someone who, despite the age difference, understood his inner struggles with surprising intensity. The two began to meet outside the sessions, occasionally sharing a beer at a quiet bar or walking around the city. These conversations with Peter brought John a long-forgotten sense of camaraderie. One afternoon, during a walk, Peter made a proposal that took John by surprise. What if we started organizing activities for other veterans, man? Something beyond the meetings. He explained that he wanted to create a volunteer project where veterans would help other veterans, offering practical support to those newly out of military service. The idea of directly helping others stirred something in John, but the responsibility felt overwhelming. However, seeing the determination in Peter's eyes, he felt compelled to consider it. After a few weeks of planning, the project took shape. They created a small support network, offering activities that included practical skills workshops, social events, and gatherings to discuss the challenges of returning to civilian life. To his surprise, John found purpose in leading these activities. Helping other veterans brought him new energy and a reason to leave the house, something he had long lost. At one of the first events they organized, he had the opportunity to meet Rachel, a woman in her 40s who had served in the army for almost 20 years. Rachel was reserved, keeping to the periphery of conversations, but her posture and gaze revealed someone who, like him, carried an immense emotional burden. John found himself drawn to her quiet resilience and began talking to her whenever he had the chance. He realized that, by offering support and a friendly shoulder, he was, in a way, healing himself. Over time, Rachel became an important figure in the meetings, helping to coordinate activities and developing a friendship with John that, for both of them, was a mixture of mutual understanding and respect. There was something therapeutic in their conversations, where words were few, but their presence for each other was meaningful. Through these new relationships, John realized that what he offered to others also came back to him in unexpected ways, filling emotional gaps he never thought could be filled. The project routine brought not only stability but also challenging moments. In one particular meeting, a new veteran, Charlie, joined the group. Charlie was a man in his 50s, with a hardened face and a gaze that seemed to see through people. He didn't talk much, but his stance and tired eyes revealed a difficult past. John, now leading part of the activities, tried to approach him but was met with an icy silence. He noticed that Charlie, like he once was trapped in his own abyss and didn't know how to ask for help. For weeks, Charlie remained distant, participating in activities almost mechanically, avoiding any deeper interaction. John understood that resistance well and was patient, offering support without pushing. One day, during a woodworking workshop, a therapeutic activity the project offered, something changed. While carving a piece of wood, Charlie began to talk. In a low, almost inaudible voice, he started to share fragments of his story, as if working with his hands had unlocked something in his mind. John listened silently, respecting the vulnerability of that moment. Charlie spoke about losing friends on the battlefield and the difficulty of reconnecting with his own identity after returning. Listening, John realized how intertwined their experiences were, how their pains had similar roots. That afternoon marked the beginning of a new friendship, and he felt, more than ever, that the volunteer project was becoming a mission he couldn't abandon. Months went by, and the project grew. The initial group of veterans that John and Peter began to help expanded, and now they were approached by other community groups wanting to support the work. This responsibility brought unexpected challenges but also a sense of fulfillment that John had never experienced before. He was no longer just an isolated veteran. Now, he was part of something bigger, something that offered hope and direction to people who, like him, had lost their way. At one of the end-of-year events, John stepped onto the makeshift stage to give a speech. With a firm voice but a racing heart, he thanked everyone for participating and reminded them of the importance of unity and mutual support. He knew his words were not just a closing speech, they were a reflection of his own journey of healing and transformation. The veteran who had once been consumed by pain and isolation now found purpose in serving others, and it strengthened him in ways he had never imagined. That night, as everyone was saying goodbye, Martha approached John and handed him a small thank you card, saying that he had become an example for the group. He smiled, a genuine smile he hadn't experienced in years. As he watched the group disperse, he felt at peace, certain that he had finally found his path. The volunteer project had become a transformative force in John's life. He no longer just participated in activities. He led, organized, and was seen as a guide for other veterans. However, even with these advances, he knew his healing journey was far from over. There were moments when the shadows of the past returned, bringing with them the weight of traumas he was trying to overcome. And it was in one of these moments that he met Mark. Mark was a newcomer, a war veteran with a somber look and a constant stance of alertness, as if always ready to react to any threat. His presence in the group was silent and rigid, and he rarely spoke to anyone. Observing Mark from afar, John recognized in him the same resistance he once displayed, a protective, invisible wall built to keep the world at a distance. John knew that Mark's pain was deep, and despite his experience, he hesitated to approach him. In a group meeting, Mark shared only a brief phrase about his experience, an almost casual comment, but one laden with evident emotional weight. Some things are just hard to leave behind. John, sitting beside him, felt the weight of those words. He decided he would try to reach out, even if the process was slow. After the meeting, John discreetly approached him. "Mark," he said with a calm voice, "if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." Mark looked at him but remained silent. John realized that forcing any interaction would be useless. He needed to allow Mark to follow his own pace. Even so, he didn't give up. At each meeting, he tried to offer a bit of support. Sometimes just a nod, other times a brief conversation on neutral topics like sports or music. One night, during one of the woodworking activities that were part of the project, Mark finally spoke. The room was quiet, filled only with the soft sound of tools, and it was then that he began, in a low voice, as if speaking more to himself than to anyone else. "I don't know how you deal with it," he said, looking at John. John, realizing Mark was referring to his own pain, put down his tools and turned to him. "The truth is, it's not easy," John replied, keeping a calm tone. "But I learned that ignoring things doesn't make them go away. I guess, at some point, I realized that carrying everything alone wasn't working." Those words made Mark reflect, and for the first time, he looked at John differently, with an expression of mutual understanding. Over time, Mark began to share fragments of his story, moments of loss and suffering that haunted him. There was one specific episode, a decision he made on the battlefield that resulted in the death of a close friend. Mark carried the weight of guilt like a cross, feeling responsible for what had happened. John listened empathetically, feeling the profound impact those memories had on his new friend. He knew Mark needed to confront that guilt, but the path would be difficult. In the following weeks, John and Mark began meeting more often, outside project hours. They walked around the city, talking about everything and nothing, building a relationship of mutual support. By helping Mark, John found himself revisiting his own scars, realizing that parts of himself still needed healing. But somehow, helping Mark also strengthened him. Each conversation was a reaffirmation that they didn't need to carry the weight alone. One day, while they were walking through a park, Mark stopped, looking out at the horizon. "Sometimes, I think I'll never be able to forgive myself," he said, his voice almost a whisper. John placed his hand on his shoulder and replied, with the firmness of someone who had walked that path, "Forgiveness is a long road, Mark, but taking the first step is the hardest. And you've already taken that step. What comes next is a journey, and you're not alone." Those words resonated deeply with Mark. For the first time, he seemed willing to consider the idea that he might one day let go of the guilt consuming him. John felt a sense of fulfillment seeing that his presence was making a real difference in the life of someone who was also fighting his own demons. It was a reminder that, no matter how challenging the journey was, there was always the possibility of healing and redemption. The friendship between the two men solidified as an unbreakable bond, and for John, each step taken alongside Mark was also a reaffirmation of his own purpose. By helping him, he found new ways to rebuild himself and leave behind the most painful parts of his own story. And together, they discovered that the path to peace was not linear, but as long as they walked side by side, the journey became lighter. Months had passed since John began his journey in volunteering, and now he found himself in an unexpected position. The man who had once been consumed by silence and pain had become one of the central figures in the Veterans Support Project. He didn't just assist with activities but also inspired others to follow the same path of healing and overcoming. His story was living proof that, even in the face of the deepest traumas, it was possible to find light and redemption. During an end-of-year ceremony organized by the community center, Martha invited him to share his story. John hesitated, but as he looked around and saw the faces of so many veterans he knew well, men and women who, like him, had fought internal battles after returning from war, he realized that perhaps his words could make a difference. Taking a deep breath, he stepped up onto the small stage and faced the audience, bathed in soft lights and attentive gazes. "When I came home after the war," he began, his voice steady, "I felt like a stranger in my own life. I thought there was no place for me in the world anymore, and I lived for years believing that carrying this pain was the only way. But today, I realize there's another way. Each of you here has helped me see that healing is possible, that we're not alone." His words touched the audience, and he noticed that each gaze held empathy and understanding. As he stepped off the stage, he was met with warm applause and heartfelt hugs, a moment that sealed his journey of transformation. After the ceremony, John spoke with several veterans and volunteers who expressed how his story had resonated with their own experiences. Many thanked him, and he felt overcome by a deep gratitude, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He realized that this work wasn't just a way to occupy time or seek relief from his pain, it was now his life's mission. He wanted to continue helping other veterans find their way, and he felt that his presence there was, in itself, a constant healing for him too. The impact of the project had expanded beyond what he and Peter could have imagined. Other groups and community centers began to adopt their model, inspired by the support network they had created. More veterans were finding refuge and guidance, and the success of the project was visible in each new face that joined and in every story of overcoming that was shared. John knew that the journey for many there would still be long, but he hoped that each person would find, as he had, the strength to keep going. At the end of the night, while helping Martha tidy up after the ceremony, she handed him a small gift, a photo album capturing significant moments from the project. "It's a small token, John, but we want you to know how much you mean to all of us," she said, smiling. Flipping through the pages, he saw images of events, workshops, and each new face that had joined the group. In each photo, he recognized the resilience of veterans who, despite the challenges, had decided to fight for a new chance. As he walked home, John reflected on everything he had experienced since he allowed himself to take that first step. He thought of Peter, Mark, Rachel, and so many others who, like him, faced the shadows of the past every day. He felt at peace, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. There was a genuine satisfaction in his heart, a recognition that he had finally found his purpose. The next morning, John woke to sunlight streaming through the window and felt a tranquility he'd never thought possible. Looking around, he realized that the house, once filled with darkness, was now a space of peace and reflection. He knew there would still be difficult days, but he also understood that, with the support of his new community and the purpose now guiding his life, he was ready to face them. John Miller, the man who once wandered aimlessly, had been reborn. The war had left its marks, but he had found a new path, built by each act of helping, each conversation, and each smile exchanged with those who, like him, understood the depths of pain and resilience. As he opened the door to a new day, he smiled. He was ready to continue his journey, and this time, he knew he wouldn't be alone. We hope John's story touched your heart and inspired you. If this journey of resilience and renewal resonated with you, don't forget to like, comment, and share with someone who needs to hear this message. Your interaction makes a difference and helps bring this story to more people who might find inspiration. Together, let's spread hope and transformation.